Wiki Wiki Wiki, NES Works presents The Legend of Zelda.
Takes levers too, but with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda. Awesome! Intense!
No 1987 NES release, and arguably no game release that year on any platform had quite the impact of The Legend of Zelda, at least not in the US. This was a seismic event in gaming, the biggest console debut since Super Mario Bros., firm and final proof that video games were indeed back. And not only that, but that consoles could hold their own in terms of depth and substance against computer games, while doing so by using their own endemic vocabulary. Zelda would have been a big deal even if Nintendo hadn't hyped it up. But they did, fully recognizing the significance of this adventure. The company broke format with its own pixelated black box and silver variant packaging designs for a solid gold box featuring a painted shield covered in heraldic imagery drawn from in-game icons and a small cutout window revealing the unique, shiny, golden cartridge within. They promoted the game heavily through their Funtime newsletter and a series of surreal television commercials that played up the game's mystique and complexity. Zelda was huge and Nintendo knew it, and they made sure that players knew it too. 1987, as you're aware by this point, saw an explosion of games on NES that pushed the standard of console design away from arcade-driven blips of action to meteor adventures that walk the line between pure twitch action and something more involved and cerebral. From original titles like Kid Icarus, Metroid, and The Goonies 2, to the wild revamps of arcade creations Rygar and Section Z, the thrust of this phase of the NES's life somehow became about exploring a very specific new form of gaming on the system. Zelda then stands as the fulcrum of this pivot to adventure, adapting the slow, grindy intricacy of a PC role-playing game into the console-friendly journey whose hero interacted with the world through the use of the NES's two face buttons. It wasn't the first attempt to adapt the RPG to television gaming, but it was undoubtedly the biggest, best, and most successful effort in that vein to this point. Of course, Zelda didn't come into existence in a vacuum, but due to the US console industry lapsing into a coma for several years during the mid-80s, we missed out on a lot of the historic context that led to Zelda. Aside from Atari 2600 games like Adventure and the enigmatic and never-finished Sword Quest series, American console fans had very little exposure to the action RPG genre. Zelda could only have emerged from the petri dish of Japanese gaming, where the idea of smashing RPGs and action games together had been developing for quite a while. It also helped that the traditional RPG was a decidedly Western invention that had been slow to see many meaningful localizations into Japanese. By the time Japanese gamers finally got proper RPGs to call their own with the likes of the Black Onyx, developers like Nihon Falcom, Namco, and TNE Soft had already made considerable headway into producing viable action RPG hybrids. In Japan, influential action RPG Zelda arrived a few months before influential proper RPG Dragon Quest. And Zelda in turn owes its existence and design to games like Dragon Slayer, Sorcerian, and Hydlide, which combine the RPG concepts of dungeon exploration, inventory system management, and experience-based character leveling with the arcade concepts of running around and surviving on grit and reflex. Most of all though, Zelda probably owes its greatest debt to Namco's Tower of Druaga, an outlandish attempt by Xevious designer Masanobu Endo to merge a 60-level dungeon crawl with Pac-Man-style maze action. Druaga did okay in Japanese arcades, but it really took off when it hit Famicom in August of 1985. The esoteric secrets and punishing design of Druaga didn't pair well with the jarring anxiety of arcades, not to mention the need to pump 100 yen pieces, a whole dollar basically, into a machine every 3 deaths. But at home, players had the time to soak in the experience, trade tips with friends, and prod and poke their way through Druaga's endless mazes with a guidebook in hand. Druaga launched in Japan right around the time that Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka wrapped work on Super Mario Bros. For Famicom. Mario, of course, was meant to be the final, definitive statement on cartridge-based games, a work of staggering cleverness that somehow coaxed 32 mostly unique stages out of a paltry 32 kilobytes of storage space. The Mario team's next mission would be to come up with a suitable launch title for the company's new Famicom Disk System, a device that accepted small floppy disks rather than mask ROM cartridges. Miyamoto and Tezuka wanted to create a game that would take advantage of the disk system's biggest selling features. namely the fact that it had 4 times the storage capacity of the Mario cartridge and the ability to record data. What they settled on was an adaptation of the role-playing genre. Evidently, the Zelda team toyed around with a few different ideas early on, including a first-person viewpoint and a game based entirely around dungeons, which suggests they spent a good amount of time researching the RPGs of the era, such as Wizardry, before settling on a game that feels a great deal like that fresh new Famicom hit, Druaga. While I've never seen any actual evidence that Zelda was patterned directly after Druaga, the two games seem to have far too much in common to be a coincidence. And it's hard to imagine Nintendo's devs would be unaware of one of the biggest current hits for their console. And that's fine. If Zelda owes its concept to Druaga, it certainly builds on and improves on it brilliantly. Of course, we've already seen a fair few disk system titles for NES, including Castlevania and Section Z. But Zelda did far more to capitalize on the peripherals features than any of those games. It's huge, complicated, and impossible for anyone to complete in their very first play session. Zelda takes place in a massive, for the time, open world viewed from a top-down perspective. The entire game advances screen by screen rather than scrolling freely the way Mario did, but the overall world consists of a whopping 128 different locations arranged in a maze-like 16 by 8 grid. Hidden within this world are 9 dungeons plus countless caves containing shops, treasures, and secrets. Together, the 9 dungeons comprise nearly twice again as many rooms as there are screens on the overworld, and it's all persistent. When you defeat a boss, claim a treasure, bomb or burn open a hidden passage, or reveal some other secret, those changes carry over to the next play session. Zelda's world, Hyrule, isn't just deadly and huge, it's a place where players are meant to spend weeks, even months, exploring its extremities and unraveling its mysteries. You can go literally anywhere in Hyrule from the very outset. Of course, you probably won't get far your first time through, even if you claim the sword in the cave on the very first screen. Portions of Hyrule are locked away behind illusions and barriers. And even if you know the secret of traversing the Lost Woods to reach the land's western reaches, the monsters who live there fire sword beams across the screen that can take out poor protagonist Link in 2 shots. But again, you're not meant to conquer Hyrule in a single go. It wasn't designed as a test of reflexes, though certainly there's some of that here, but rather as a place to inhabit for a while, to get to know, to experiment in, to figure out what was the deal with the old women who sat silently in caves, or what's up with that mountain scene that just keeps going up and up and up. What does it mean that there are secrets where fairies don't live, or that if I master using a sword I can have it? Some of the methodology involved in completing Zelda seems awfully opaque and arbitrary by 2018 standards. Who could possibly have deduced on their own that blowing a flute on a certain screen would cause the lake where fairies don't live to evaporate? And who would have the patience to burn every bush and bomb every block on the overworld in search of secrets? But this game needs to be judged by the standards of 1987, where it felt frankly a lot more intuitive and fair than most other games of this type. Yeah, you had to bomb and burn stuff on the overworld to find secrets, but eventually you noticed that no screen contained more than a single secret. Plus, the game shipped with an extensive fold-out map of Hyrule that revealed all but the northernmost reaches of the land and laid out the first few dungeons to help ease players into the quest. Plus, you could pay people hiding in certain caves for tips, and the secrets of dungeons were considerably more straightforward than those of the overworld. And if we're being fully accurate, we should judge Zelda by the standards of early 1986. After all, it debuted in Japan on the disk system at the time of the peripheral's launch in February 1986. The game took a year and a half to reach the US, in part because the NES had arrived so far behind the Famicom, and in part because Zelda required what probably was the most extensive Japanese to English localization that had ever been produced to that point. But mostly it took a year and a half for the game to come west because the technology to make it work on NES didn't exist until then. It wasn't until the advent of the MMC-1 mapper chip, previously seen in Kid Icarus, that Zelda could work as an NES game. The Zelda NES ROM contains 128K of bank-switched memory, allowing the cartridge to match the Japanese release almost perfectly. The only thing missing in the US release are the sounds generated by the disk system's extra audio channel, something that's fairly inconsequential. The American title screen theme lacks the literal bells and whistles of the Japanese release, and some sound effects are different. But in terms of content, the two releases are effectively identical. The American version arguably offers a better experience than the Japanese, in fact. The disk system release required a fair amount of waiting for the game to read or write to diskette, but the American version is seamless and instantaneous. You jump in, pick up the game, and immediately you're in Hyrule. Gotta run in the middle of your adventure? Into session by using the not at all secret second controller code and save instantly. Unlike Kid Icarus and Metroid, Zelda didn't require the use of cumbersome passwords. The secret here was that Nintendo added a lithium battery to the interior of the Zelda cartridge, allowing the game to save its data to a special backup memory cache. The onboard battery maintained an extremely minimal current that kept the volatile backup RAM circuit from losing power. So as long as the cart's battery contained energy, its temporary memory would remain intact. In theory, cartridge batteries were meant to last just a few years, but some Zelda carts still hold a charge more than 30 years later. It's a pretty remarkable piece of tech. Nintendo didn't create the idea of a battery backup. It appears the first cart to use a battery was a port of Falcom's Dragon Slayer to Epic's Japan-only cassette vision console in 1986. However, Zelda definitely brought the tech into the mainstream, and battery-backed Famicom carts would soon follow in the wake of their NES counterparts. Only a handful of NES games ultimately used backup batteries. The cost of incorporating them into carts raised their price considerably. Nintendo controlled the cart manufacturing process and could absorb the cost themselves, but very few third parties had the stomach to ask consumers to pay $70 or $80 for an NES game. Still, this technological innovation opened up new horizons for cart-based games, which would increasingly make use of onboard batteries until the 32-bit era, which shifted game storage from the media itself to external memory devices. And it certainly helped to build Zelda's mystique. Not only was the cartridge shiny and golden, it could save all of Link's progress instantly. Nintendo pitched Zelda as a never-ending adventure in its ads, which wasn't quite true, but it certainly seemed a fair representation at the time. Zelda's quest is massive by comparison to other 8-bit games, and once players completed the adventure, a second quest opened up with all new dungeon layouts, new mechanics, and completely rearranged overworld secrets. Kids at the time spent months grappling with Zelda's mysteries, swapping discoveries with one another, and poking around in every corner of Hyrule. Completing Zelda was a badge of honor. Completing the second quest, the kind of feat that would get you called a liar on the playground. And what of the game itself? Well, it's a brilliant distillation of role-playing concepts into action mechanics. It allows players to take a more participatory role in combat than its predecessors. Games like Adventure, Dragon Slayer, and Hydlide used a primitive passive run-and-bump combat scheme that would appear in 1987 Ys as well. Zelda, on the other hand, gives players two action buttons, one to swing Link's sword, and the other to make use of a secondary item. There are nearly a dozen different active tools to be collected in the course of the quest, ranging from a boomerang capable of stunning foes to bombs that can blow open walls and smash rocks. Zelda requires a fair amount of management through a menu screen, referred to in-game as a subscreen. Besides tracking Link's progress and growth, the subscreen also allows you to select your active secondary tool. In addition, in dungeons, a subscreen charts your progression through the current labyrinth, especially useful once you acquire that dungeon's map and compass items. Your tool selections are dynamic and evolve as you use or improve them. The old man's letter is replaced by potion bottles once you figure out that secret, the boomerang changes its appearance if you find the magical upgrade in level 2, the enemy bait item vanishes once you feed the hungry moblin, and your bow and arrow item changes depending on whether or not you've acquired the bow, the arrow, or the all-important silver arrow. Link also evolves over the course of the game, but he doesn't do so by simply killing monsters. There is no experience system in The Legend of Zelda, which has turned into a huge sticking point for tedious pedants who refuse to acknowledge the game's connection to the role-playing genre despite its bold distillation of RPG tropes and mechanics into an action format. No, Link doesn't earn points for killing monsters who only drop cash, health refills, and expendable tool charges when defeated. Instead, he increases his strength by acquiring better swords, and to do that, he needs to boost his endurance by gaining heart containers that add to his hit point total. These are dropped by bosses, hidden in a few places around the world, and offered as part of a fool's gambit by old men who allows you to choose a permanent health upgrade or a single-use health refill potion. Zelda incorporates a number of clever, minor shortcuts to make its RPG concepts work in an action format. Link stabs in real time, and dodging foes comes down to literally evading their attacks. You can buy tools and gear at shops, but you never become down by inventory management. For example, rather than load up on arrows as individual consumable items, you simply expend cash every time you attack with a bow. Simple magical rings boost your defensive stats, and just about every upgrade path for gear only has 2 or 3 steps. Tools like bombs and candles offer valuable perks, but also work within fixed limitations. Bombs are a limited resource and explode on a set fuse timer, boomerangs are fast but can only damage the absolute weakest enemies in the game, and candles can only be used once per screen until you acquire its hidden upgrade. Zelda is meant to be a brisk, fast-paced take on the RPG. Dungeons can be completed in minutes rather than the expansive hours required for a single floor of a wizardry game. While completing Zelda doesn't require intense dexterity, there is a definite need for reflex and skill. But this is balanced by the puzzle-solving element of the game, which is less overt here than in later Zelda games, but presents players with enigmas and riddles that have to be mastered in order to succeed. The design of the game is open enough that it can be approached in many ways. You can tackle dungeons largely out of order, barring a few requisite permanent tools for advancement like the ladder, flute, or candle. Some players enjoy the challenge of taking on the game without acquiring health or sword upgrades, or even by ignoring the sword altogether until the last possible moment. Even without meaning to, players are likely to stumble across levels out of sequence, and that's fine. The Legend of Zelda is flexible enough that it works. Yet there is an admirable elegance to the game's structure. Every dungeon contains a tool that helps you advance further into the game. Some are optional, like the Rod and Book of Magic that provide an alternate form of attack to your sword, while some are mandatory, like the Raft that opens up the path to level 4, or the Flute that reveals the entrance to level 7. Each dungeon boss guards a fragment of the Triforce of Courage, the mystical token which Link must acquire in order to take on the final boss, Ganon. While you can march immediately to the entrance to the final dungeon from the moment you launch a new adventure, you can't advance beyond the first room of the labyrinth without possessing the complete Triforce. The 8 preliminary dungeons grow in complexity and danger as you move through them, introducing deadlier enemies and more devious traps with each new stage. Simple slimes and snakes give way to boomerang-chucking fighters who are soon joined by aggressive knights wielding impenetrable shields. Wizards, plucked directly from Tower of Druaga, warp around the room in later dungeons, while strange monsters chase Link in order to devour his expensive upgraded shield. Flashing bubbles render Link momentarily defenseless, while grasping wall masters attempt to seize him and return him to the dungeon's entrance. Bosses require quick reflexes and can soak up multiple strikes by Link's sword, and later dungeons feature returning bosses as common encounters, usually in greater numbers. Some of these enemies can only be defeated with specific attacks, like the dinosaur-like Dodongos whose thick hides can only be pierced by bombs, or the eye-like Digdoggers that shrug off all attacks until you attack their weak point, their sense of hearing. The dungeons contain good things too, like hidden weapons and obscure rooms filled with cash. Sometimes you'll encounter old men who offer useful tips, or even sell you permanent upgrades for your bomb-carrying capacity. All of this leads up to Death Mountain, the taxing final labyrinth in which the villainous Ganon lurks, holding the Triforce of Power captive, along with the Princess Zelda. Death Mountain is many times larger than any other dungeon, contains all the nasty tricks of the other stages, along with daunting new threats, and is traversed by crisscrossing the stage through a series of complex underground passages. It's not enough to simply reach Ganon. First you need to find the silver arrow hidden in his lair in order to destroy him. But for the silver arrow to work, Ganon has to be weakened with sword strikes. Not that he fights fairly, warping invisibly around the room and taking potshots at Link. It makes a great finale to a grand adventure, and it's little surprise that nearly every single element of this classic game has been reproduced and reworked through the series' many sequels. Zelda's impressive sensation of adventure made a profound impression on countless players. And the series' most recent entry, Breath of the Wild for Switch and Wii U, was specifically designed to recapture the essence of this NES game in modern open-world terms. It's almost impossible to overstate what an important release The Legend of Zelda was for Nintendo and the NES. No, the game didn't come into existence in a vacuum, but it succeeded at bringing together many different threads of game design and ambition into a single extraordinary package, which in turn was packaged with extraordinary care. The Zelda series immediately became a key pillar for Nintendo's game business, and developers far and wide rushed to imitate its design. But that's all business stuff. The important thing is that for millions of NES-owning kids, Zelda represented a huge and engrossing world, a cast of intriguing characters, and most of all, a shiny prize to savor, most likely for months and months of their lives. Next time on NES Works, oh, you think Nintendo's done revolutionizing games, do you?